They sent in their DNA, hoping to find roots. Instead, they found nothing. No Rusyn, no Lemko, no Boyko, just a blur. Eastern Europe. Slavic. General population. As if centuries of memory had been wiped clean by a drop of saliva. But what if it wasn't a glitch? What if the erasure was by design? Because the Rusyns were never given a country, never given a box to check. Not by maps, not by governments, and now, not even by the machines that claim to read our blood. Picture this. A village in the Carpathians. Stone crosses leaning into the wind. A language passed in whispers. A people who survived empires, but were forgotten by algorithms. One woman took the test. She knew her ancestors. The mountains, the dialect, the church songs. She waited, and when the results came back, her identity wasn't just missing. It had been renamed. She said, "We always knew we were different, but then the test said we don't exist." But blood remembers what borders forget. And in a lab, somewhere quiet, somewhere cold, a forgotten genetic marker lit up. It didn't belong to Ukraine, or Poland, or Hungary. It belonged to something older, something buried under centuries of silence. An ancient lineage that didn't just survive. It resisted. But here's the twist no one expected. That ancient blood, it didn't appear in all Rusyns. Not even close. Because just one valley over, another Rusyn village, carried a completely different origin story. Not cousins. Not kin. What the tests uncovered wasn't a forgotten ethnicity. It was a contradiction. One people. Three ancestries. No shared past. So the question isn't just, who are the Rusyns? It's this. How can a single identity carry three separate bloodlines? And what did the Carpathian mountains hide that history refused to tell? They thought they'd uncovered a lost people. But instead they found three. Lemkos, Boykos, Hutsuls. All Rusyn. All from the same mountain chain. Same language. Same church bells. Same embroidered shirts passed from mother to daughter. And yet, genetically, strangers. The lab didn't lie. It split them. The distances between these subgroups were wider than the gaps between nations. Wider than between Rusyns and Ukrainians. Wider than between Lemkos and Romanians. Wider than between Hutsuls and Croatians. The results were clear, painfully clear. The mountains that were supposed to unite them had sliced their bloodlines apart. How does that happen? How can a people light the same candles, bury their dead under the same soil, whisper the same lullabies, and still not share the same ancestral mothers? The scientists were stunned. The cultural logic broke down, and something deeper began to unravel, because it wasn't just one subgroup that was an outlier. It was all three. Each one carrying different maternal DNA, different migration shadows, different ghosts. The Boykos leaned westward, toward ancient farmers. The Lemkos reached sideways, into forgotten Balkan veins. The Hutsuls, well, their story hadn't even begun to be told yet. This wasn't one forgotten origin. This was a shattered mirror, a shared identity, split into pieces that had never fully fit together. And yet somehow, they all wore the same name. Rusyn. That name bound them in songs, in grief, in exile. But it didn't bind their blood. And just when the scientists thought it couldn't get stranger, they saw a spike in one haplogroup. A lineage so old, so rare. It hadn't been found at this level anywhere else in Eastern Europe. It belonged to the Boykos. And it whispered of a maternal ancestry. That predated Slavs. Predated kingdoms. A bloodline that might have come from the very first farmers to walk this land. Before the Rusyns had a name. Before history even began to write. The spike was real. One haplogroup, H almost absent, T suddenly dominant. It didn't match any Slavic signature. Not Ukrainian, not Polish, not Russian. Instead, it pointed backwards. Far backwards. To the first farmers in Europe. To a time when there were no kingdoms. No churches. No Rus. Just quiet fields and barefoot migrations. The Boyko women, hidden in misty Carpathian valleys, carried maternal lineages that traced not to Slavic tribes, but to the Neolithic, to the linear pottery culture, to the people who first shaped clay and tilled soil in the Danube basin, people who moved through what is now Hungary, Slovakia, and then vanished, Except they didn't vanish. Their bones became churches. Their blood became lullabies. And in the Boyko DNA, those whispers still live. This is where the ground begins to shift. Because the Boykos are seen, by language, by religion, by culture, as East Slavic. Yet their mitochondrial DNA says otherwise. It doesn't just predate the Slavs. It ignores them. One line of their ancestry links not to Ukraine, but to the Udmurts. Finno-Ugric people, speakers of a different tongue, carriers of a different past. Imagine it. You pray in Old Church Slavonic. You dress in the embroidery of saints. But your mitochondrial line remembers a time before those saints ever lived. Before Cyril, before Methodius, before Slavic even had name. The Boykos didn't descend from one tribe. They absorbed millennia. They are a palimpsest, layer after layer of forgotten migrations. And in that, they're not alone. Because their lineage wasn't the only outlier in the Carpathians. Just across the ridge, separated by trees and mist, another Rusyn group held a maternal story that was even more strange. One that reached not westward, but far east. To a place no one expected to find, in the heart of Slavic Europe. The Boykos carried echoes of Neolithic fields. But the Hutsuls, their blood whispered from the waves. Not Black Sea, not Danube, but the Atlantic. Because when their mitochondrial data came back, it shocked every analyst in the room. Highest levels of haplogroup H1 ever recorded in Eastern Europe. Nearly identical to populations in Spain. Not modern migration. Not medieval traders. This was older. Older than nations. Older than alphabets. A genetic match buried deep in time. Going back over 10,000 years. So the question isn't just how it got there. It's how it stayed. Because the Hutsuls live high. Above the fog lines. Shepherds, musicians, mountain mystics. Guardians of fire dances and wooden icons. But what they were truly guarding was something no one could see. A maternal lineage untouched by conquest, untouched by collapse. A ghost from the Holocene, preserved in these narrow valleys like a sealed jar of memory. H1, a strand that swept west with the first humans after the Ice Age. A strand that circled the Atlantic and somehow found a home in the Eastern Carpathians. No records mention this journey. No book explains it, but the DNA does. It sits there quiet, timeless, as if waiting for someone to ask. And now, someone finally did. The Hutsuls aren't just part of the Rusyn puzzle. They're holding a fragment of Europe's forgotten map. A piece that should have disappeared, but didn't. Because something in those mountains, those cliffs, those rituals, kept it alive. But here's where the logic breaks again. If the Boykos point to early farmers, and the Hutsuls echo Atlantic blood, then what exactly are the Lemkos? Their language sounds familiar. Their faith, their food. But their DNA? Their DNA carries something far stranger, something almost out of place. Because buried in their blood is a signal that doesn't come from Europe at all. The Hutsuls carried whispers from the Atlantic. But the Lemkos? The Lemkos carried something that didn't belong in Europe at all. At first glance, nothing seemed strange. Fair skin, pale eyes, Slavic words wrapped in mountain melodies. They looked familiar, felt European, until the lab opened their mitochondrial window. And there it was, M*, a haplogroup that barely appears in Europe. A genetic thread more often found in Central and East Asia. A maternal ghost from far beyond the Carpathians, winding across deserts, over the steppe, into the heart of the Slavic highlands. No history book had written this part. No folklore had warned them. And yet it was there, clear as code. Their faces said Slav. But their blood carried another story entirely. And that wasn't all. Another marker surfaced, haplogroup I, at levels no one expected. The highest frequency ever recorded in Europe. Not in Austria, not in Poland, but in. The Lemkos carried an Asian whisper in their blood. But the men, the fathers, their story was something else entirely. In Vojvodina, northern Serbia, Rusyn families have lived for over 200 years, surrounded by Slavic neighbors, sharing markets, sharing borders, and yet never blending. When scientists tested their Y-DNA, the results were startling. No trace of Serbian lineage. None. Not diluted. Not hidden. absent. They had crossed into Serbian lands, but their fathers never crossed back. This wasn't just genetics. This was something else, something chosen. A phrase came up again and again in local interviews. Words passed like folklore. We always married our own. Not prejudice. Not superiority. Survival. In exile and displacement, identity became protection. They held on to names, foods, songs, and bloodlines. The male line became a thread of memory. Unbroken. It was like a river, flowing straight through time. Never merging, never flooding. Just moving forward quietly, holding the shape of who they were. Even in modern cities, even in multi-ethnic towns, the Y chromosome told a story of refusal. Refusal to forget. Refusal to fade. This was more than genetic continuity. It was cultural rebellion, written in DNA. But then came the bigger question. If the Rusyn men in Serbia are still carrying this ancient paternal code, then where did it start? If they've guarded the bloodline, untouched for centuries, who gave it to them in the first place? Because as researchers traced the Y markers backward, what they found wasn't just Slavic. It wasn't just Carpathian. It pointed somewhere older, somewhere royal. A bloodline tied not to villages, but to a dynasty. A name whispered through medieval fire and war. And a legend that began with men who sailed down rivers. From the north, the Y chromosome trail didn't stop in the Carpathians. It climbed higher into history, into legend, because one lineage stood out. N1A, Scandinavian, the same haplogroup carried by the Rusyns, founders of the Rus. Yes, the Rus, the very word at the heart of Rusyn. For centuries, history told us the Rusyn name came from the east, from Slavic princes, from Byzantine faith. But the DNA says it started with Vikings, Norse warriors, Varangians who rowed longboats down frozen rivers, men who weren't born to speak Slavic, but came to rule it. The Rurik dynasty, carriers of N1A, built the first Eastern Slavic states. Kiev, Novgorod. They didn't just govern. They gave their name. Rus. And with that name, centuries of identity were born. But here's the twist. The Rusyns don't share that blood. Not most of them. They carry the name of Norse kings. But their own DNA tells another story. One rooted in mountains, not palaces. So what does that mean? If your body says one thing, but your name says another, which one is real? You light candles for saints. You call yourself Rusyn. But your bloodline may never have passed through Kiev or Scandinavia at all. This isn't just science. It's a crisis of self. The banner of the Rus flew with Norse hands. But now, it waves over Carpathian shepherds, over exiles, over forgotten valleys that never knew a king. And in those valleys, something else was preserved. Something no Viking ever touched. Because long before the Rusyns sailed south, before Slavs, before names, there was another people here, buried in silence, buried in stone. And when archaeologists opened those graves, the DNA inside had never left. The Vikings came and went. Empires rose, flags changed, names were rewritten. But under the soil, something stayed. It began with a dig. Vassiliv, Eastern Carpathians. A medieval burial site, untouched, forgotten. They weren't royal graves. Just simple villagers. No gold. No crowns. Just bones. And silence. But when scientists tested the remains, the results froze the room. Their DNA, nearly identical to living Rusyns. 1,000 years. And the sequence had barely changed. Same haplogroups. Same mitochondrial echoes. A bloodline that refused to break. They compared it again, against surrounding populations, against known migrations. And still, these ancient people weren't strangers. They were family. It wasn't just continuity. It was defiance. Because while borders shifted, while rulers demanded new names, while Soviet maps erased the word Rusyn altogether, the blood didn't care. The markers held. Quietly. Faithfully. Passed like old songs. From grandmother to granddaughter. Like a melody you don't remember learning, but somehow always knew. And it hit something deeper. Because for generations, Rusyns had whispered the same phrase. We were always here. It was folklore. It was faith. And now it was data. The bodies buried in Vasilev didn't just prove origin. They proved memory. Ancestry that never needed a flag to exist. But then, why? Why do modern DNA tests still erase them? Why do drop-down menus still have no place for Rusyn? How can blood hold 5,000 years of truth, but the world still call it invisible? And if the science now proves they never disappeared, why does the world keep acting like they were never real to begin with? They proved it in the bones. They traced the blood. They confirmed the line had never broken. And still the test said no. No Rusyn. No village. No history. Just Eastern European. Just Poland. Ukraine. Hungary. Like typing your grandmother's name and being told she was a typo. One woman looked at her DNA report, then at the old photo on her dresser, a black and white face in a wooden valley church, and whispered, "My test erased my grandmother's village." It wasn't a glitch. It was repetition, because this had happened before. In censuses, in classrooms, in government files stamped in red, the word Rusyn was scrubbed clean, replaced, redefined, first by the Empire, then by the Soviets, now by code. DNA companies, driven by population samples and borders, group the Rusyn genome into everyone else's. Algorithms don't see the nuance, don't feel the silence. So 1,000 years of memory is compressed into a vague region, a cultural story flattened into a cluster of national averages. But this isn't just technical failure, it's emotional collapse. Because when you've already fought to survive erasure, when your language was almost lost, when your songs became relics, when even your name was denied, you expect the science to restore something, and instead, it repeats the silence. This is what happens when data doesn't listen to history, when precision can't find people whose very identity was built on being miscounted. But something unexpected is happening, because in the ruins of those missing labels, in the gaps between categories, a deeper signal is rising, something the computers didn't look for, something the empires couldn't reach, a buried frequency, one that doesn't ask for recognition. It remembers, and it may be the one key that finally explains how these people survived, without ever being seen. The code couldn't see them, the map wouldn't name them, and yet they're still here, not because of what they were told, but because of what they remembered. Lemkos, Boykos, Hutsuls, not branches from the same trunk, but roots twisted, tangled, buried deep in different soil. One carries Neolithic mothers, one echoes Iberian winds, one holds a thread from the east, ancient, almost silent. Science wanted to place them, to file them into one box. But every test revealed a contradiction. Every answer opened another door. This isn't a people with one beginning. It's a mosaic of migrations, fractures, returns. A people who didn't come from one place, but became one anyway. Not through sameness, through survival. Because the miracle isn't that the Rusyns share one bloodline. It's that they built one memory, a shared language carried across valleys, a faith held in carved wooden icons, a silence endured in exile, preserved in songs. Their strength is not in how alike they are, but in how fiercely they refuse to disappear. Every mountain held a different past, but somehow all the trails still led home. And now DNA can't place them. But that's not a failure. It's the proof. Proof that they don't belong to one history. They belong to all of it. In a world obsessed with purity, with categories, with perfect origins, the Rusyn genome refuses. It resists the label, escapes the border, becomes something else. Not a single story, 1,000, and just across another ridge, in another quiet valley, there's one more story waiting, equally forgotten, equally alive, and just as hard to explain.